Well, good morning, everyone. I think it's time to start. We're just on 10. Thank you for those who have joined us early. Beside me in the room this morning, I have Kylie Eltham from Fletcher Building, and down the road at the port is Rosie Mercer, who will be sharing some of her Ports of Auckland business insights, and in what I hope is sunny or Wellington, but I'm not sure if it's ever been sunny there of late, is Kapua Smith, who is going to talk to us about their science-based target journey from Contact Energy. I'm very grateful that you have all joined us this morning. Thank you. Those of you that may be brand new to this workshop series, I'm Rachel Dupree and I work at the Sustainable Business Council. My co-collaborators should also be on this webinar listening in and ready to answer any questions that are relevant for them to leap in and do that. And that is David Tong from the campaigns team at WWF, who are closely connected to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and represent that in New Zealand, and Stu McKenzie from Enviro-Mark Solutions, who you all know and comes with a brain full of technical expertise on science-based targets. So yeah, welcome to you two in particular, and to Sean Bowler, who's been doing lots of behind the scenes work at Enviro-Mark. Just wanted to update you on the plan for today, if I can get my slides to the next slide, and there we go. So I think I've already talked a little bit about this, but just top tips for the webinar. Bear with us. This is in fact the first time I've used Zoom for a webinar. We've all done a few practices and we're getting there, but bear with us for technical glitches along the way. We'd love you to ask questions. Each of the panelists has got about 15 minutes and then 5 minutes at the end for any questions you'd like to ask of them. Suggest you do that with the chat function, and hopefully you can find the chat function in the drop-down toolbar. Mine's currently sitting at the top of my screen and the chat function is a little bubble. Some of you may have it at the bottom of your screen and it's also a little speaker bubble. And if you'd like to ask a question, just let us know who you are and where you're from so we can orientate a little bit to that. That'd be great. Thank you. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so here's the plan for this morning. So a little bit of welcome from me. We're going to run through with Kapua kicking off first, then Kylie and Rosie. There'll be time for Q&A at the end, and then we'll do a little bit of a chat about where we go to next and get your ideas on what resources and things you think might help you with science-based targets from now as you work those up. I guess the main update that I have for you is to make a really big shout out to New Zealand Post. So between our last webinar and the current one, New Zealand Post have made a commitment to setting a science-based target, and I know they've been working for some time behind the scenes on that. And hopefully you also all saw their commitment to go carbon neutral by 2030. Again, I know that's a culmination of an enormous amount of work, but the start of a new and interesting journey about how they manage their carbon footprint differently at New Zealand Post than they have in the past. And I'm sure if there's time towards the end, Sam will be able to give us a little bit of a rundown on what their approach to that is so that we can share some of that insight. Sorry to put you on the spot, Sam, that just popped into my mind as a great thing to do at the end of the webinar. So yeah, we might give you a little few minutes to do that, Sam. So well done, that's really impressive. I guess the other piece of work is that from here at SBC, we have done some outreach to We Mean Business. We Mean Business represent a range of business-orientated not-for-profits working in the sustainability space and largely focused on carbon. So, for example, CDP is part of that We Mean Business collaboration. They are really interested in what we're doing in New Zealand and what we're doing on science-based targets, and have got some, they are all on the Science-Based Targets Initiative working to lift the number of companies that have signed up. And they have a list of some of New Zealand's larger companies who they have on their radar as thinking about might be great to get them engaged in science-based targets. And we're having a little bit of a conversation about what they're asking me is how far down the journey are companies in New Zealand, and what can we do to offer any help and support. So I'm also using that as a little bit of an advocacy platform for us to ensure that our companies who are applying or have committed get some help with verification once they get to that stage, and have done a little piece on your behalf this morning, Stu and Sean at Enviro-Mark, about the fact that you've got your target submitted and waiting for verification. So I think this process has given us some good international connections, and if any of you need a hand from that point of view, we can certainly help move that along behind the scenes. So I'm going to leave it at that and invite Kapua to talk with us about their journey at Contact Energy, and they have actually already committed to science-based targets, so I'm really looking forward to hearing from her.
Kia ora everyone, my name is Kapua Smith. I am the Head of Sustainability at Contact Energy. As mentioned, we are along the way towards setting science-based targets, and that we have some draft targets in place. We have signed up as committed under the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but we haven't yet been verified. So today's presentation is really a spiel about how we got to where we are today, but we are by no means all the way through the process, although we have had lots of learnings to date. So I've only got about 4 slides to show you, but really it's just talking through the journey that we've had, the key moments for us. So one of the key moments was around buy-in from our leaders, from the people in our teams whose role it will be to help us reduce our emissions, all the sort of moments of truth that we faced as a business. So that's a bit of a spiel about who we are. And if you could just flick to the next slide, please, Rachel. I'll start by giving a bit of a spiel about who Contact Energy is. So we are one of the larger energy generators and retailers in New Zealand. About 80% of our generation comes from renewable resources, so geothermal and hydro. We also produce some energy from thermal gas peakers. We have around 562,000 customers, and we sell electricity, natural gas, and LPG. As a business, we are committed not just to setting science-based emissions reduction targets, but to doing more on climate change in general. So while we have been walking along the science-based targets journey, it's actually been alongside a broader decarbonisation strategy, which has been adopted by our business all the way up to the board. So there's lots of exciting things happening all at once. So if I could just get the next slide up, please, Rachel. I'll let you know a little bit about where we're at now. So Contact signed up as committed to setting a science-based target in February this year, which isn't that long ago. So as you can imagine, the journey towards that moment of actually getting a letter signed and sent in took quite a lot longer than what is reflected by the moment we said, yes, we were going to commit. And it actually started about, I'm going to say at least a year ago, which was when we became aware of the Science-Based Targets Initiative work. And it took a good year to work through influencing to get the business in the right space to be able to look at such ambitious targets. I'll talk more a little bit on that later. But a key part of that was actually the adoption of a decarbonisation strategy, because one of the key themes we focused on at Contact was alignment between all our work programs, our business strategy and our sustainability strategy being integrated, and how we then integrate our emissions reduction and our targets into that broader work program. So following that, signing up as committed, we developed our draft targets, which I've got here in the presentation, which I'll read out to you. So our targets are to reduce our 2017 Scope 1 emissions by 30% by 2030, to reduce our 2017 emissions intensity by 40% by 2030, and to convert 1 PJ of industrial heat to electricity by 2022. So we used the sectoral decarbonisation approach to identify the top 2 targets, which are our absolute emissions reductions and our emissions intensity targets. And then we had a look at the criteria around SBTI, and as a company that sells natural gas, we were also required to set a use of products sold target. Now the criteria around that was quite broad, but in saying that, again, we had our decarbonisation strategy, which I'll talk to in more detail shortly, which says that as a business, we're committed to going out and converting fossil fuel energy sources into renewable electricity sources. So we tied our use of products sold target into that wider aspiration of the business, which is how we ended up with our conversion of 1 petajoules of industrial heat to electricity by 2022. And just to give more meaning to that 1 petajoule, that's equivalent to about 250 megawatts of energy, which is a significant amount. So we're really quite excited about the ambitious nature of that particular target, as well as our other 2. So once we set our targets, we actually it has been a bit of a learning journey. We went through the criteria again to check what it is we need to do before we go and get verified. And actually we have a lot of hygiene work to do in terms of we hadn't previously gathered our Scope 2 and 3 emissions data because it wasn't required for our existing reporting. So that's why we held off the verification process, and we're still holding it off until we have that data, which we will have for this financial year. So we're looking forward to going through that verification process in July and August as soon as we have that baseline data. In saying that, there are other criteria. So for example, the assessment of our Scope 3 emissions, we know already that they do not exceed 40% of our total emissions footprint. So we were able to make assessments on what our targets would be. So we have a pretty good idea of where we're at, even though it wasn't a linear process for us. There was a lot of back and forwards going through the process of setting the targets, making sure we've got our house tidy and everything in place that we need to be verified. So that's a learning in itself. If I could just flick forward to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about how we got to where we are now. So a big part of it for us was, as I mentioned earlier, setting our decarbonisation strategy as a business. Are you able to flick to the next slide, please, Rachel?
Sorry, Kapa, my computer has just decided to take a thinking pause.
No worries.
Despite me. And of course, what we'll do, it will rush on through in a tick. Okay.
No worries. I'll just keep talking. So in 2017, Contact adopted a decarbonisation strategy. That is about decarbonising the energy sector in New Zealand. And we set a goal for our business. It's a high-level goal that our board approved, that Contact wants to help New Zealand drive towards a low emissions economy by focusing on driving towards a decarbonised energy system. And when we talk about energy, we're not just talking about the electricity system in New Zealand. We are talking about things like transport, how we can support electrification in transport. We are talking about things like processed heat and industrial use of fossil fuel sources, and how we might be able to support a shift towards electrification in those spaces as well. There are some great benefits for New Zealand, and obviously on the climate change front there's great alignment, but there is also a commercial benefit for Contact. So that was an important moment for us in our journey, as we adopted that as a whole business. To support that process, what we've done is, at a governance level, the board signed off on that strategy, but we've also developed a set of KPIs for how they would measure our progress towards achieving our decarbonisation strategy. As part of that, we're looking at setting KPIs for our CEO that really cascade out to all our teams across Contact. And the great thing about doing this all at once is these KPIs are all tied in with our SBTs and all the other things we want to achieve in the sustainability space, as well as the things we want to achieve in a commercial aspect as well. So the decarbonisation strategy was core to our ability to getting buy-in, not only to set a SBTI, but to focus our people resources on achieving the targets that we set. So following the adoption of that strategy, which was very high level, what we did was a series of design thinking workshops. For those of you not familiar with design thinking, it's basically user-centered thinking, where you go out, you interview people to understand what it is they care about, and you design solutions to meet what those stakeholder or those perspectives are saying that they need. So through that process, we identified a whole lot of different key themes, but the two I want to talk about today was authenticity and leadership. So our stakeholders, and we interviewed about 80 different people through this process, told us that if we're going to do decarbonisation well, we need to have authenticity. In other words, what we do in-house needs to align with what we're selling, and we need to show leadership on climate change. So those were two key moments in terms of influencing the business and how we went about focusing resources not just on what we sell, but also on what we do in-house. And our targets, our SBTIs, are focused largely on what we do in-house. So that was a key moment for us as well. And at the same time, it's been a convergence of a whole lot of things which have led to this outcome for us. But the other piece which has been quite influential is the input of other stakeholder groups, actually putting pressure on businesses to do more in this space. And one example of that is the task force for climate-related financial disclosures. A lot of our investors and our large investors have actually said to our CEO, you must report to this. We expect you to report to this. And as part of our journey, what we've been able to say is, well, actually, if you want to meet the requirements of the TCFD, we need to be looking at these targets, these actions. And that's been a really important driver for us as well. And all of this together has led in to that second to bottom line there, which is buy-in from leaders. So I guess the learning from us is when we had originally started this process, I actually started from the bottom up. I went and I spoke to our wider engineering teams who work on our sites. And I talked to people across the business who deal with different elements of our core business, I guess, which contributes to the emissions on our generation side. And it was just going nowhere fast, because the technical discussions led us to all kinds of outcomes, and it just went round and around and around. And actually what it took for us to sign up was our leadership team and our CEO stepping up and saying, this is what we want to do, we're doing it. And once that happened, everything else fell into line. And I guess the irony is our CEO really bought into it. And the way that was confirmed to the rest of the business is he actually went and he said it externally. And he said it to a reporter, and it was reported. So we were able to just move. Once that had been done, it was just get on with it and make it true without being cynical. That's what the focus has been. And since we've got that buy-in, everything has just moved very quickly. In fact, our CEO wants it done ASAP, and that's what we and our team are working on. So I've got one more slide coming up, which is really just sharing our key learnings. I think for us, the big focus has been on buy-in. It's been getting the right conditions in order to set these targets and deliver on them. I mentioned quickly the difference between having your leaders on board versus working bottom up. I think it's really important you have both. So while I said the key moment for us was when our CEO just said we were doing it, the fact that we'd had those conversations with people on the ground, people who are experts in the energy production side of our business, were absolutely vital because there was an alignment, because they knew it was coming. We had socialized it. So the difference now is that instead of our conversations being focused on, can we do it? Is it achievable? What would this do? The conversation is now, how are we going to make it happen? How are we going to do it? What's it going to take to deliver on this? Which is a completely different conversation and actually really positive. The next thing on that list you see there is, I've called it striking the right balance. So part of the reason we were going around circles is because people came at these targets from different perspectives. Some people wanted to see targets which were, in their view, achievable based on what they knew today. Whereas some people, including myself, wanted aspirational targets, which means, in essence, taking a little bit of a leap of faith, because you've got to innovate in order to achieve them. And the other balancing point there is about being affordable to our customers, because we also know that the transition can disproportionately affect people on low incomes if we do not manage this well. So for us, striking the right balance meant looking at what is achievable, what is aspirational, and what is affordable within the context of a 2-degree future. So that was a big conversation point for us, and an aha moment was actually being able to articulate that those were the 3 things that we were looking to manage. And so while we have set, I'm going to call them aspirational targets because the pathway to how we're going to achieve them is not 100% clear, we do know that they are achievable if we do the right things. And we've given ourselves enough time with 2030 targets to be able to do some of the things and to learn learn and to innovate in order to achieve them. So that was a key learning for us. The other thing, and I think I've already touched on this through the whole presentation here, really is looking at the big picture. How do our targets help us achieve our goals? And so the business, having set that decarbonisation agenda, was absolutely critical for us because there was a clear line of sight between what we were doing with the targets and how we were supporting the business to achieve that decarbonisation strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, with our stakeholders giving us the lead, that authenticity and leadership was absolutely vital to that strategy. The environment was right to move those SBTIs along very quickly. And with leadership being one of those key drivers, I will say that being a first mover was vital in making us move faster. So when I first took this idea through to our leadership team, only Auckland Airport had been verified under the SBTI. And I could demonstrate to them, if you did this, this would be a clear leadership position for us, but you've got to get in quick. And so that's what we did. We signed up as committed, but it was a real selling point for our business that we would be one of the first and the first in our sector, potentially, depending on what the other generators now do and also how quickly they move. And the other thing, I guess, the big learning was preparing for verification. It isn't just about setting targets. And perhaps that was a naive thought for us anyway, moving into it. The tidying our house aspect has been quite a lot of work. Getting our inventory up, doing our scope 2 and 3 targets, making sure that we understand the criteria and are meeting all the points on that. That actually takes a lot of work. And we're still working through that. But in saying that, at every point, we just go back and we check that our targets are still aligned. And the environment and the work we've done with our leaders means that if we need to adjust our targets slightly in order to meet the SBTI requirements, we can do that. So I don't know if you saw the wording that I had put up around our targets, but I'll read it to you again. It says the board approved draft emission reduction targets pending verification by the SBTI initiative, meaning that if we somehow through the process find that they're not eligible for verification, we have freedom to move, space to move on that. So I think that's really important. And then the other learning we've had too is we have been approached by so many different organisations to support different initiatives, different commitments. We're also proactively identifying different commitments to support that help promote what we're doing in this space, but there are just so many. So our leadership team have actually asked us to look at what are the most significant initiatives we can get behind, because we are getting commitment fatigue. There are so many coming at us from different organisations. So that's been a real challenge for us. And I note it here because the SBTIs are part of that broader landscape of commitments that businesses are looking at signing up to or being asked to sign up to. So for us, the SBTI was something that we sought out. It wasn't anything that someone brought to us. But what we noticed was, if you look at the broader commitments that are floating around, aligning your targets with the 2-degree future are generally a base criteria in all of them. And so for us, the SBTI piece was a foundational point through which, we were enabled to support those other commitments, but with hand on heart saying we were doing the right things. Our actions were aligning with the words that we were saying. So those are really the key learnings from me, and that's me, unless there's any questions.
Thank you, Kapua. That was brilliant to get that insight, and particularly that learning around the pre-socialisation, and then that you're now focused on how, not what or why. And so that obviously meant you did a very good job talking about why 2 degrees was important way back at the start, because the why must have had to happen at some point.
Yeah, the why has been a very long conversation.
Yeah.
But the moment it switches very quickly, and it's a different gear to work in. Yeah. So it's interesting.
How long has the why conversation been?
So it depends on when you take it from. So I mean, if you're talking about a broader sustainability story, the why is constant. We're constantly talking about different elements and how they should be incorporated into our strategy. If we're talking about the SBTI, I think we brought it up about a year ago, and that was I participated in the PACE working group around this, and that was when we first raised the conversation internally. But at that point, the environment wasn't right. It actually took us about a year. I'm going to say the conversation took it wasn't a year-long conversation. The conversation that we had once the decarbonisation strategy was set was a 5-minute conversation and a couple of half-hour presentations to key teams. But what led up to that was a year's worth of conversations with people who didn't actually understand what we were talking about. So when I first went to our operations leadership team, for example, I had to explain Paris targets. I had to explain what the landscape was. You have to explain things which I think we as sustainability professionals take for granted.
Yeah, that's great insight. Has anyone got any questions on chat that they'd like to fire through for Kapua? I mean, she will be here till the end, and we can do that at the question Q&A time at the end. I might just keep a track of those. Feel free to pop them through and I'll be able to see them as they pop up. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Kylie Eltham, who is sitting here beside me. I will mute myself so that we manage our feedback challenges. And she is going to talk to you about their reasonably significant carbon reporting journey at Fletcher. It's also a significant day in the history of Fletcher Building because they are announcing a new strategy as we speak in Sydney, which Kylie's trying to keep half an eye on. We, as one of New Zealand's largest companies, I think from the initial look that Kylie's had, there's a reasonably large commitment to sustainability right up front in that announcement, which is great to see. So let me hand over to you now, Kylie. I will mute myself. I will undo contacts slides.
Anyway, welcome. Ooh, hang on a minute.
Okay, sorry guys, we're going to, you'll have to shut that down, I think.
Right, welcome everyone. Right. Okay. I just, hang on a minute.
I'm just going to... Thanks, Rosie. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, Rachel really enjoyed my talk then.
Yeah, it was. Okay, sorry, guys.
That's right. Now I can stay on this one. Okay. Yeah. So I was just saying to Rachel before that when I said that I was happy to do this, I thought I'd be standing in a room with other people. And for some reason, that seems much easier. And this has probably proved why it seems so much easier. But anyway, yeah, so over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to perhaps tell you a wee bit about how complex Fletcher Building is. And I've worked in Fletcher construction for about 8.5 years, and I thought I knew how complex Fletcher Building was, and I knew all the bits that we owned, but it turns out until you actually start working for Fletcher Building, you don't really appreciate how complex it is. So Fletcher Building is one of New Zealand's largest companies, and in New Zealand we own pretty much the entire construction supply chain. And as Rachel said, there's a new strategy that has been launched in Sydney this morning. So we will see how that impacts things. I think the initial indications are that Formica will be sold off, and so will Roof Tile Group. So they're part of our international business, which you'll see shortly. So these are the bits that I'm going to cover off. Obviously, emission targets, we have actually had them in the past, and I'll talk to you a wee bit about that. Discuss scope 3, and then what have we learned on our journey. So Fletcher Building is quite complex, over 21,000 employees, 5 divisions and 35 business units, and spread right across the world. As a result of the strategy launched this morning, we'll start to see the focus back on our New Zealand and Australian operations. So the operations setting up in Europe and the Americas is mostly Formica and the roof tile group. So it turns out that Fletcher Building actually owns some really random businesses as well. So we own a foundry in far north Queensland, and we also own a on-site wastewater treatment company. That's presumably because they use the concrete tanks that Humes makes for them, perhaps. So some of the brands that you may recognise that Fletcher Building do own. I'm sure if you drove to work today, chances are you might have driven on a road that perhaps Fletcher Construction may have constructed in the first place, or Higgins asphalted, using aggregates from Winstones and cement from Golden Bay. Depending on what's in your kitchen, you might have some stuff from placemakers or Myco, and you might have Gerard roof tiles or some products from Easy Steel on your house as well. So we've got plenty of businesses around the place. Chances are you've got some Laminix in your kitchen as well, that all Formica. So this snapshot just came from a post that I put together following our financial year 2017 carbon reporting. So this was really just done to start to raise some awareness of carbon in the business. So people, we run the SOFI database for carbon reporting, and so people, relatively religiously enter data in, and then it sort of disappears into this big ether. So I really wanted to bring some of that data out and show people that it's useful for them to enter data for us, and what we can do with it. So the first one, obviously the top 3 emitters by region. So these are absolute numbers and just total. So I did get some feedback from the likes of, Formica going, oh, hang on a minute, it's because we're a really big operation in Europe. That's why we're the biggest. And it's like, yep, that's fine, but we just want to start making people aware of what's going on. So obviously we own Golden Bay Cement. Now making cement is a very carbon intensive process, and we just can't get around that. However, there are ways. It's obviously about making your cement as efficient as possible will be the key to that. Winstone wallboards, which is GIB, and then Winstone aggregates rounds out our top 3 emitters in New Zealand. In Australia, we've got Laminix and Fletcher Insulation, so they're busy making pink bats. In Australia, we make pink bats in New Zealand as well, but the scale of the Australian operation is just a wee bit bigger. And then obviously Formica in Europe. So the interesting thing is that of the 97% of our emissions actually come from 2 of our divisions, which is building products and international. So we will see, if Formica and roof tile group does get sold off, then we will see our absolute or our total emissions drop significantly, and that will become someone else's problem, one would presume. So the other good thing about Fletcher Buildings, we do have a lot of data, and it goes right back to about 2008. So that's pretty good. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And Scope 3, a wee bit more hit and miss with regards to data. So the next couple of slides I put together at the end of last year just for a board pack, just to introduce the board or raise their awareness of the board a wee bit more around carbon and carbon reporting and our exposure to carbon. So we were once the leader in New Zealand when it came to carbon emissions and target setting. And actually back in 2009, we set our first target, which was to reduce our CO2 emissions by 5% between 2008 and 2012. This assumed similar levels of production in 2012 to what had happened in 2008, and the target was not reached. We certainly didn't reduce our emissions by 5%. Please don't ask me how much we missed it by, because I've forgotten to look that bit up, so don't ask me tricky questions on that one. So in 2012, a new target was set. So the new aim was to reduce carbon emission intensity by 10%. We also did quite a bit of work with ECA around energy efficiency and lighting upgrades and things like that. Sophie, our carbon reporting database, was also set up, but obviously someone went through a very large job of backdating a lot of, or back entering a lot of data, because the data goes back to 2008 in it. Obviously the global financial crisis hit in 2008, and that actually had a relatively large impact on the business. Construction generally feels the impacts of such large effects about 18 months behind everyone else, and so that was sort of really only started to be felt 2010, 2011 in construction, and that's just because of the long lead time with projects. So another couple of interesting things in there. So off their own bat, TINS, which is Tasman Insulation New Zealand, so they make the pink bats in Penrose. They, back in 2008, decided to replace their natural gas furnace with electricity, and that resulted in a 50% reduction in emissions intensity per tonne. Pink bats have been really great, actually. They've done some other great work around water efficiency and things like that, and got a couple of key people there that are really onto, looking at trying to make the plant as efficient as they can in order to stay in the market. And the other interesting thing was in 2012, Golden Bay Cement reviewed their use of coal, and they looked at diverting wood waste from landfill, and they've been doing that since, and that resulted in a reduction of 50,000 tonnes of CO2 each year. And we had a change of CEO in about 2012, and by about 2015, because we hadn't met this new target, they sort of became referred to as an aspiration, and then they didn't really get talked about at all. So no one really talked about our carbon targets for a couple of years there. Obviously in 2016, the Paris Agreement got signed, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals came out. But as you can see, nothing super exciting happened. There's a big blank space there for Fletcher Building, but we kept on tracking the carbon data and seeing it increase. And then in 2017, Golden Bay Cement, in their efforts to try and improve their efficiency of the plant and reduce their carbon emissions, they looked at doing a tire-derived fuel, and they have received funding from the Waste Minimisation Fund to work with that. And hopefully once it's up and running in about 2019, they expect to reduce their emissions by about 15,000 tonnes, which is a good start. As I said, we've got lots of data, and when you play around with it, you can get all sorts of things, but it just shows quite a bit of variability, really. So carbon intensity, so this is measured on $1 million of turnover. So last year, for every $1 million of turnover, we emitted 212 tonnes of CO2. And then if you look at comparing our emissions across Fletcher Building between 2007 and 2017, you can see Golden Bay Cement still dominates our emissions profile. Formica and Laminex increased a reasonable amount, and that was just through growth and acquisitions that they had. And then TINS and Fletcher Insulation, which is pink bats, you can see they've grown as well, but that's just through increased productivity. And this slide's quite a good slide in the fact that you can sort of track, it's quite interesting because you can see our scope 2 emissions, the impacts of energy efficiency projects, and you can see that's continues to head down. You can see where Fletcher Steel, so Fletcher Building sold the steel mill out at Otahu in 2015, and you can see a drop as it was sort of winding down, and then we've had a massive increase as a result, I suspect, of increased productivity. But but you can see our scope 1 sort of bobbled along a bit and have been steadily heading up, and I suspect they will probably head up for a wee bit more, for probably another year or so before we start kicking in with some form of target and start driving some change. So science-based targets or not, our journey to science-based targets has been slightly backwards, you could say. So we had a new CEO who's just announced the strategy this morning. He arrived at the end of last year, Ross Taylor. And in the strategy, he has announced today that Fletcher Building wants to be recognised as an industry leader in sustainability with full sustainability reporting across environmental, economic and social domains. And my previous conversations with him, he's indicated that it's not a matter of if we do sustainability, it's just a matter of when. And I suspect, so that conversation was end of last year, and he obviously had a few things that he'd like to sort out in Fletcher Building before he starts to focus on that, but it's good to hear that it's obviously going to be a key part of our strategy going forwards. So while he came to us and said, you know, what does 2 degrees mean for Fletcher Building? And so that's how we've sort of started going down the science-based targets route backwards by finding out what 2 degrees could mean. Does it mean a 40% drop in emissions or a 70% drop in emissions? Then it's about getting the CEO and the board on board, which I think will be a lot easier under this our current CEO than previous CEO. And then there's obviously a whole piece that Kapua spoke about bringing the business along on the journey. Obviously, Golden Bay Cement is a large emitter, and they may not be able to make, say, if the target ended up being 40% reduction, they may not be able to get that far. They may only be able to make 20%. So does that mean Placemakers has to do a bit more and achieve 60% reduction to subsidise across the business? The initial numbers do look quite challenging, but I suspect it's going to be about breaking it down into bite-sized chunks and really mapping the strategy across the business and selling it that way. I also think, because Fletcher Building does carbon disclosure project reporting, and just working through the CDP reporting for this year, I can see a really strong link back to science-based targets with some new questions around that. So I suspect, given our involvement in CDP, we will probably end up heading down the science-based target option and actually commit at some stage in the next 6 to 12 months. The question around scope 3 was a tricky one. When we started to look into it, it turns out that our data collection for scope 3 is pretty haphazard. We did have some flight data. From what I could work out from our last year's numbers, just on our Australian and New Zealand businesses, we flew enough trips around the world, in fact, enough trips to go to the moon and back about 143 times, I think it was. So it's quite a bit of flying, and that's just from our Australian and New Zealand businesses. It was quite tricky to get data at the group level for the scoping exercise required under science-based targets to figure out whether our scope 3 emissions were more than 40% of our scope 1 and 2. We managed to get some limited information out of one of our business units, being Laminex, and that indicated that scope 3 emissions would be about 40%. We're just trying to get a wee bit more data out, but I've made the executive decision, but my recommendation would be that as a large New Zealand company, we can and we should influence the supply chain. So my recommendation to the CEO and the board will be that that we do look at scope 3 targets and set a target around that. And looking at that, probably freight to our sites, and then once the product's been made away from our sites, business travel and our purchased goods and services would probably be the 3 key areas that we will focus on. But there has been a reasonable amount of discussion around this. And then just quickly some reflections and learnings on what we've learned so far. I think carbon accounting is a dark art. It's not a science, yet someone has just said, oh, but we're about to do science-based targets. So Yeah, it is. I still work on the theory though that it's a wee bit like you go to the accountant, and that's why they call it cooking the books, I suppose, because it is a dark art and not a science. Data verification is key. So as I said, we've got screeds and screeds of data. It hasn't been verified for a while. I suspect there's bugs and hiccups in it, but we do have data, so that's probably, we're a lot further down the track than some businesses. But I think it really probably needs to be internally and externally verified more regularly and budgeted for. That was the other key thing there. Now, I thought I could have a go at developing a science-based target and then perhaps get someone to peer review it, I should say. So back in January, I started the year off by reading the sectoral decarbonisation approach report, which was pretty riveting reading. And yeah, I thought, yeah, I can whip something up. And I'm really glad that our sustainability manager, so thanks, Julie, if you're listening in, said, I've got some money, let's get the experts to do it. So this is not a plug for Stuart at Enviro-Mark, but I have to say we've been working with Stu and he's been great. And I'm really pleased that he's managed to come up with what he's come up with rather than me. I think it would have taken a long time. And while there's no guarantee if we do decide to commit and submit, I'm confident that our targets that we set would have a far greater chance of getting approved by SBTI than if I was just to make them up and wander off and fill in the form. The other bit, I think, and it's probably more of a general thing around sustainability, is procurement plays a key role. So I think it's more than just the person with the carbon reporting or energy reporting in their title or their job description. There's a lot of information out there that the procurement people can help us with and get suppliers and things on board. And I think particularly around our scope 3 emissions, they will play a really key part in that. And that will be along the lines of when they're setting up contracts and stuff, ensuring that the data is available and things like that. And I think the only other key thing is, you can probably see from our journey, so we did have targets and we had a lot of energy efficiency programs and stuff around to try and meet these targets, and then they sort of went off the boil. And I think the biggest thing that Fletcher Building can probably learn and others can take from it is the fact that, you know, you've got to have targets. Even if you aim for them and you miss them, at least you'll be a lot closer than if you didn't have targets. And you can probably see the impact of not actually having any stated targets on Fletcher Building's emissions over the last few years, been increasing reasonably steadily. And I think that was probably reinforced. I went to a Wasteman's talk a couple of months ago, their 30th anniversary, and they had some people from the C40 cities there talking about waste and their lofty zero waste emission targets. And one of them said, in fact, several of them said, you know, they've got these great zero waste targets, which they're not going to meet, but at least they've got them because they'll be a hell of a lot closer than if they didn't have them. So I think that probably goes for emissions targets as well. So will the board and the CEO sign up to science-based targets, or just a target based on science, which was a question raised in the last seminar on this? Who knows? I think based on this morning's strategy announcement, I think they probably will, and with that strong link back to the Carbon Disclosure Project. So I think we just need to, make a plan and set off on the adventure that will be science-based targets. So that's it from me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kylie. That was really a really kind of open and honest conversation about some of the challenges at Fletcher Building. I'm going to introduce Rosie now and let her take over and share her slides and do her talk, and then I'll just gather up any questions that are coming through and we can run through those at the end. So Rosie, over to you. I will stop sharing the screen and enable you to pick up.
Thanks, Rachel. How long do I have?
Yeah, you've got about 20 minutes.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, hi, I'm Rosie Mercer from Ports of Auckland. I'm going to try to share my screen, and I'll look out for any messages to tell me whether it's worked or not. Go with this. Rachel, can you nod if that is showing my PowerPoint? Thank you. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey that Ports of Auckland's been on so far. It's really interesting listening to both Kapua and Kylie because we're all at different stages, but interesting to hear where each of us have differed in the challenges and opportunities that we've managed to leverage. So Ports of Auckland, about 18 months ago, about 2 years ago, we developed a sustainability strategy. And the reason we started that strategy was really as a company, in terms of our social license with our community, we had pretty much hit rock bottom. We'd been in the High Court being challenged about construction projects that we were doing. And we really realised that it was a time for us to change the way we were engaging with the community and start focusing more on being a good corporate citizen and looking towards the future and what Ports of Auckland would look like in 20 or 30 years' time. So setting a strong vision was quite crucial for us. And so essentially the vision that we set was to be a leading sustainable port at a global level. And we set our strategy based on triple bottom line, but our core, our core environmental goal was our zero emissions 2040 goal. And we set that goal back in 2016 when we weren't even measuring our emissions. So it was ambitious and a little bit naive, I suppose, but we decided that it was the right thing to do and that we needed to change the way that we were working. So in order to start working towards that goal, we did our first emissions inventory last year, and we did it in line with CMARS and became the first port in New Zealand to get CMARS certification. My computer's jumping slides without me. And so we did our first year with the CMARS, and so we've built quite a robust inventory with scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And so this year we've decided to work on the science-based targets. So why are we doing science-based targets? Well, a lot of it has to do with our very strong and ambitious leader, Tony Gibson. So he has a excellent network of peers amongst him, and he was chatting to them, to a few of those other business leaders one night, and he said, "Yep, we're gonna commit to 2 degrees, this 2-degree future." And he came back and he told us all at the port that that was what he committed to. So having set our zero emissions roadmap late last year, in the middle of last year for our CMARS certification, we had to start rethinking what our emissions reduction roadmap looked like to make sure that it would meet with the science-based targets. And I'll go into a little bit of that a little bit later on in terms of the difference between our zero emissions target and what our science-based target reduction roadmap will look like. But I just want to talk a little bit about driving change, because everyone, and having listened to Kylie and Kapua, everyone's, the leadership varies in each company, and the catalyst for change is different within each business. And it's been really interesting watching Ports of Auckland, where it's really been driven from the top down. It's starting with ambitious leadership, saying we need to change and we need to do something that's enduring, and finding those targets that fit within our vision in order to set us on that journey to creating that enduring change is really important. And don't underestimate the value of saying something publicly, because once you said it out loud in the public, it's there and it really forces you to commit. So an example of that would be, so obviously Tony committing to that last year, and then James Shaw mentioning Ports of Auckland zero emissions goal at the launch of the Zero Carbon Bill a couple of weeks ago. And at that point I thought, oh heck, we have to deliver on this now. But in terms of getting buy-in from the rest of the company, I think it's really important it's great for that senior leadership for them to decide that they want to do it, but to actually engage the workforce within the business to achieve it requires getting that buy-in. And I'm going to see if I can show you a video. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, I'm only going to try for a little moment. If it doesn't work, I'll stop. Okay. Okay. Can you see this, Rachel? You couldn't hear the sound. Is that right? Oh, sorry. It's such a good video. What it does tell you is...
Rosie, it might be because it's playing through your headphones.
Yeah, it could be. Look, it doesn't matter. The point of the video is that there's this trend towards the value of a sustainable supply chain, and that you can make sustainability your brand, and that within the supply chain, if you can be the sustainable option for brands like Tesla, for example, that there's a huge amount of value. So it's one of the hardest things to do is get the buy-in from the naysayers, and what they always want to know is how much it will cost and how you can demonstrate the value. And it very much so is a long-term investment when you're doing this, because you can't quantify the benefits within a year or so. You're talking about the qualitative and quantitative benefits that you won't be realizing for another 10 or 15 years perhaps. So it's really important that you help people within the business see that vision of where this is taking us. So in terms of finding your supporters within the business, this experience that I'm talking about is going back to when we were kicking off our sustainability strategy and doing our work with our CMARS certification. So what I haven't done yet, and what this doesn't relate to, is specifically working with people on the science-based target work yet. But what we found that was really important was creating a narrative so that you can be really consistent and just saying the same things over and over again. So making that vision quite short and succinct and repeating it whenever we could. And talking about the zero emissions work as often as you could. And eventually you find that people just know about it. It was also quite interesting through our communications team. We'll put out different types of messaging using different communication methods at different times. And it's quite interesting to see, you kind of end up having supporters coming out from unlikely places. And so I did realise that it's really valuable to make sure that you are using as many different types of communication methods as possible, particularly for a business like Ports of Auckland, where you have a range of types of roles, where you have office-based staff, you have shift staff, you have people who never touch a computer, you have people who are out on boats, you have people who are driving straddles. So you have quite a wide range of different types of employees. So you really do have to find the ways in which you can engage with all those different people to find your supporters. Because as we go to implement these reduction targets over the next 5 years, it's going to be really important to have their buy-in and have the people within the business who really want to help make a change. So for us, about building our reduction plan. So as I said, back in 2016, we set a zero emissions goal for 2040. But it's fair to say that the majority of those reductions were planned for post 2030, and that's because our scope 1 emissions is the majority of it is made up of our the diesel from our straddles. So the straddles that move around the container terminal, picking up the boxes, moving them around from the ship to trucks. They're all diesel electric straddles. And so that's where the majority of our scope 1 emissions sit. And we're about to automate our terminals. So we're actually getting a whole new fleet of straddles, which will be somewhat more fuel efficient, but they'll still be diesel engines. And they're all coming in over the next year, and they'll be all in operation by 2020. So the issue that we had was that the 2040 zero emissions goal was set after that order had already been placed, or that project was well underway. So there wasn't an opportunity to try and change that order, or it would have been very complicated to try and push for them to be zero emissions for this particular order. So knowing that they would be up for refurbishment in about 2030, that was how we ended up with our reduction plan, having the majority of our emissions being reduced by 2030. So over the period 2030 to 2040, we'd slowly transition those straddles to a zero emission alternative. Once again, my computer, it has a mind of its own. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to, we took a look at the linear and aggressive scenarios that for the science-based targets, and I've got a graph that I can show you a bit later that shows the difference between our current zero emissions plan and the linear reduction. And we really wanted to try and bring the two closer together and find some ways in which we could do that. So what did we have to do? Because we had done our emissions inventory last year, we had quite a robust list of our emission sources and the impact that each emission source was having on the overall inventory. So we went through those emission sources to identify the ones that we felt that we could have a material effect on. And we had to think about the different ways that they could be reduced. And what I'm talking about there is whether you could reduce it through behavioural changes, through operational changes, or whether those changes would need some sort of structural implementation in order to create that reduction. So what this graph shows is the two blue lines are the science-based target approaches. So the straight one is the linear and the light blue is the aggressive line. Now, all the credit for this work goes to Stu and Jan from our sustainability team here. So Stu from Enviro-Mark, and Jan, who's picked up this project and done a fantastic job. So what they've shown here in these graphs, so the green is what was our zero emission 2040 target. Temperamental. So as you can see, it's pretty much almost doing nothing until 2030, and then over that following 5 years, procuring our way to zero emissions. And I had always felt somewhat uncomfortable about it. In fairness, this graph doesn't reflect what we actually put in our emissions report for our CMAS certification, where we were trying to affect some small amounts of change between now and 2030. But essentially, these were the ones that we knew that we could hang our hats on, that we would be procuring those new straddles from 2030. So the red line is our current attempt to bring our reduction map more in line with the linear approach. So what we've done is we've taken that period between now and 2025 to say, well, what could we do to affect some significant change to the straddle diesel emissions? And we've got a few ideas about how we could do that, and some of it will be quite challenging, but we feel that we've set ourselves a 5-year period to put the research in place to make sure that we can achieve that 2024 reduction that you can see there, and then continuing through until 2035, making small reductions on the way. Now, just to clarify, we haven't yet committed. What we've been doing over the past 3 or 4 months is doing all of this work with Enviro-Mark to make sure that we felt that we had a draft target that we could that we were confident that we could achieve before we actually commit. So that work's now been done, and I'm fingers crossed we'll be committing before the end of this month, and it's our intention to try and have this submitted before the end of the year. So what we'll do following the commitment, what we're planning to do is cost up the reduction plan before we actually submit it. So the process that we're going to implement for that is over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be pulling together a working group. So this has been socialised with the exec just this week, and we'll be pulling together the working group over the next couple of weeks from people from throughout the business. And what we'll do is we'll do a high level cost estimate, and we'll also do a life cycle analysis of certain aspects of each scenario to make sure that what we're suggesting for our options actually is the best overall option. And so we'll probably use a consultant to help with a bit of that work. Just to finish off, so a few reflections and learnings from our journey so far, which as you can see, we're not terribly far along the journey yet. One thing I would do differently would be to get that working group together a little bit sooner. So sort of fighting the balance between getting some stuff done and getting things getting our ducks in a row before we go out to the wider company, and finding that balance with how really do you engage with them to make sure that they have the right amount of input. I think one thing I can say is that if ever you get the opportunity to capitalise on public commitments, do it, because it can be really challenging to prove the financial case for anything to do with sustainability and carbon emission reductions, because a lot of the benefits are qualitative at this stage, and it is hard to monetize some of those benefits. So if you can leverage that ambition and like I said, capitalize on those public commitments, then do it. From our experience, it's been really valuable to take the time to do the draft reduction plan and compare the scenarios before we commit. I think we were always fairly confident that we would commit, but it feels feel more relaxed about our commitment, knowing that we've spent that time on the draft work. And the other thing is more along the lines of what we're about to do now. It's about understanding the resources required. So it's great to have those public commitments and say you're going to do it, but you do need to work out how much it's going to cost, who needs to be involved, and I feel that setting a 5-year plan before we really start making some of those significant reductions gives us the time to plan that out quite well. So fingers crossed, this is the start of a pretty cool journey. And I must again thank Stu and Jan for their awesome work on this project to date.
Thanks, Rosie. There is a question for you. Well, there's a couple actually. For one specifically for you though, from Campbell from Fletcher Construction. Thanks, Campbell. About biodiesel, how does it fit in your strategy?
So I was intentionally silent on it because I didn't want to commit to it publicly. You're talking
to sustainability people. They're going to see the intentional silences.
So, yeah, look, it's quite clear to us that that biodiesel is the most is a really awesome opportunity to bridge that gap. There's an issue. So I tried to bring biodiesel in I didn't try very hard, but a couple of years ago, about 18 months ago, suggested that we look at using biodiesel, and the response was, oh, look, the engine manufacturers won't agree to it, you won't get insurance, and then you lose the warranties, blah, 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 blah. I said, oh, okay, that sounds really hard, never mind. And then I learned about a pilot project that Port of Amsterdam did with a company called Good Fuels over in Amsterdam. And what they did is their pilot project worked alongside the port using their harbour fleet, so their pilot boats that operate inside or up the river there, and worked directly with the engine manufacturers to test the use of the biofuel inside through the operation of their vessels. And the pilot project was really successful, and now they have their whole fleet running on this biofuel. And I thought that was a really really interesting way to go about getting the buy-in that you need for it. So that's one of the things that we will do over the next, that's one of the projects that we are planning to do over the next few years, is work directly with a biofuel provider, because for us to make a significant impact on those emissions, I want us to be targeting the B20 at a minimum rather than just the B5. So it will need that process to work alongside the engine manufacturers to pilot it. And then there's the issue of, will you be able to secure the supply of a biodiesel for that period of time, because it will be such a transitional fuel? whether you can get a supplier to commit to such a finite period of production. So those are the issues, those are the risks that we've identified. And so it's not a done deal and it's very early days, but that is a project that is in place. Long answer to your somewhat easy question.
Thanks, Rosie. There's another one here from Campbell's on a roll. So this is about business growth imperative. Kapua. I might give Rosie a wee rest and call on you to see what you think about this finite growth.
Yeah,
finite planet.
I read the question. Let me just read it again. Sorry. How do these target strategies address the dilemma of the business growth imperative, i.e. the real world of infinite growth on a finite planet not being possible? I think this is about trying to find alignment with what the global imperative is in terms of sustainable planet. The whole point around limiting global warming to 2 degrees is to ensure sort of ongoing sustainability of our planet. So ensuring that we align, our business imperatives with those targets for the betterment of the world is part of that. But at a broader level, for us as an energy company, natural resources are a huge input for us. I mean, if you think about our other generation sources other than gas, we use geothermal, which is very land-based and invasive on land, and water, and we also have hydro. So constantly working towards addressing how you sustainably use resources is central to our whole approach as a business, recognising that finite resource, that we have. So it's a constant process of innovating towards improving stewardship. And that's how we look at it. And from a science-based targets or emissions approach, to us, that's just part of that broader sustainability approach, recognising too that 2 degrees will still see some changes in our climate. So yeah, that's a big tough one.
It is a tough question, and perhaps just as a follow-up to that, you articulated the process you went through around setting science-based targets, and I'm just interested in, you mentioned innovation, so whether through the process of identifying reduction opportunities, there were any around innovation that have enabled you to start to identify commercial opportunities or growth opportunities or revenue opportunities from the process of setting your reduction plan in itself, because that gives you opportunities to grow in a different way from the way that you might have before.
Yep, and so that's core to our decarbonisation strategy. So what we're trying to do is develop more renewable power stations to displace non-renewable sources of energy, and to do that in a meaningful and reasonable way, and in a commercial way. We've got to balance that supply-demand equation. And so when we set that target around conversion of fossil fuels to electricity, that helps us move closer towards building the business case for more renewable power plants. So it is all intrinsic in the process that we're looking at. And the other thing around innovation, that's just supply and demand management, that particular aspect. But there is an innovation piece on reducing our emissions efficiency of the plants we already have in place. There are some innovations out there in the world, but the thing about power plants is that they are long life pieces of equipment. They're long life assets. So planning decisions need to be made today in order to see those emissions in the future. So we're looking at what's out there and what might be possible. But I also mentioned we didn't have all the answers at the moment. So that's part of it for us is we also need to wait for the technology solutions to be made available in order to achieve that tail end. Yeah.
Kia ora to that. I think that's a lot of people's challenges. There's an aspect of when does the technology come on board, and that horizon scanning and searching for new technologies that you need to do or tap into the parts of your business that do that. And another follow-up
Yes. So another part of our strategy, because it does go across our whole business, is doing energy audits with customers, and in particular our large industrial users, to find both emissions efficiencies there, but also cost efficiencies for our customers. So we have a project going on at the moment where we're doing that. I also mentioned briefly in my presentation that we had set up KPIs for our board to be able to monitor our progress towards decarbonisation, and supporting energy efficiency audits for customers is part of that program of work. So absolutely, that's a very good question.
Thank you. We've got 3 minutes. Is that now 2? I wanted to thank the 3 of you for sharing your insights. I know that everyone on this call will be experiencing what I'm calling the low carbon rush that's happening at the moment, and that has impacted on all of our workloads and work programs in perhaps ways we hadn't fully anticipated when we set out our work plans for the year. And so asking you to also speak and pull together a set of slides to share with the group has been part of going above and beyond in our no carbon rush time. So thank you for that. I guess the last thing I wanted to do was just come back to, if I can find them, my slides, and remind you of some of the resources that Stu shared with us early on in the process. So the Sciencebased Targets website, and he's listed a range of tools that are available on that website, and for you to go and search up. And I think I'm hopeful that our workshop series that we've run so far has helped you to get a sense of who's doing what and who might be able to help you further on your journey or with any questions that you might have. I am certainly not going anywhere, and available if any of you have got any questions and want to be connected up with other members who might be on this journey as well, depending on what you're thinking about. And Stu and David are also mines of useful information. I think as a collaboration together between WWF and Enviro-Mark and us, it's been a really useful and interesting learning process. I've certainly gained lots of insight from David in terms of WWF priorities and how they work on with the Science-Based Targets Initiative and why that matters to them. And obviously the expertise that we've had generously given to us from Enviro-Mark has been awesome as well. So thank you both for that. We've done a little bit of thinking as a project team about where to next and what kind of support you all might need to help you on this journey. And I think one of the things that came up early on was a workshop, perhaps around about the September period of time, a face-to-face in Wellington, given we ran the initial ones here in Auckland, and we can do that live stream as a refresher for others depending on where they're at on their journey, and for those who want to join in. So we'll explore that. I'd love to hear from any of you online today about any ideas or any support that you think would be useful for you into the future. There are a number of you signed up to the PACE initiative or part of the PACE working groups, and if you're not and would like to, have a look on the PACE website and you can see who to contact. And we are just also having a conversation about whether there's a role for PACE to help be a signpost to further progress and resources around science-based targets. So with that, I am going to wrap up. Thank you all very much for joining. I will send out a recording of the webinar and post it on our website for those that weren't able to come along. So thanks once again. Kia ora koutou to all of our speakers. Have a lovely day. Enjoy the weekend when it comes. Thank you. Bye-bye.